Good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is on how to operationalize vulnerability threat intelligence. My name is Patrick Garrity, and I'm excited to always be leading the effort in ongoing education regarding cybersecurity and vulnerability management, helping practitioners and leaders. So hello, everyone. I'm a security researcher here and VP at Nucleus, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I'll make an introduction in a second, but our topic's on how to leverage vulnerability threat intelligence within your vulnerability management program, something I'm always really excited about. And up to date, I've had a lot of pleasure and experience in collaborating with the Mandiant team who's with us and vulnerability research. I want to say something before I make intros and we hop in. I really am looking forward to this discussion overall. A lot of my research, I do a lot of vulnerability research, and I don't do as much of the research regarding commercial threat intelligence. What I would say is I have done a lot of research, and one of the things that excites me is the value that you got at commercial threat intelligence. Something I don't do as much publishing on or talk about is because sometimes we have to be careful on what we disclose as it relates to intelligence and commercial threat intelligence feeds. And so I just want to, really emphasize, like, this is a really, really important webinar to me because it's an opportunity to discuss some of what Google Mandiant is doing, the approach they're taking to threat intelligence and how that can be leveraged. And I always just want to encourage people whenever they can to get, access to something like vulnerability management, threat intelligence feed with Mandiant. It's just so important, and the value goes way beyond anything you're going to find from scraping and collecting OSINT data. So we have that's my excitement disclosure. We have about an hour, and our goal is to make it incredibly valuable. If you have questions, the chat is open. I can see a ton of people commenting. We like emojis, we like discussions. So please bring your questions, comments, concerns, anything related to what we're talking about today to attention if you have questions. But joining me today, two very special people who work at Google Mandiant. And I'm really excited. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with them several times. First off, Jared Semrau, Director of Vulnerability and Exploitation and Management. And you produce and create a lot of different content, even across the blog and whatnot at Mandiant as well. So thanks for joining us today, Jared.
Oh, it's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me, and welcome to everybody who has showed up today. Thank you.
Awesome. And then we have Hoch, Manager of Global Cyber Defense at Mandiant, who works closely with customers implementing operations in regards to security operations centers. So thank you as well, Caleb, for joining too.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be here. And yeah, thank you to everyone who joined and is coming along the journey with us today.
Great. Well, we have a lot of people on, and they're here to learn a bit about vulnerability intelligence in general. And so I think, before we get started, from both of you, I think it'd be awesome to hear a little bit about your roles and, how they've evolved and what you do at Mandiant. So Jared, if you want to go first, we'd love to hear high level what you're doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you. So just real quick, full background in about 10 seconds. I've been with Mandiant for about 13 and a half years now. My background is in threat intelligence analysis. So my current role is as the Senior Manager of Vulnerability and Exploitation team with Mandiant Intelligence. And what that essentially means is I am responsible for the management of the day-to-day operations of the team that creates and maintains the vulnerability intelligence related reporting that we do. In addition to that role, I am also kind of the de facto product owner of everything vulnerability intelligence related for the company. So I have a lot of interactions with customers over the years, as well as a lot of say into where the product goes. And that's me in a quick nutshell. Oh, Patrick, you are muted. Sorry.
I'm caught on my mute issues. First it was headphones, before that LinkedIn. But technology these days. No, but I think it's awesome. Like, it's been a pleasure as I've had questions like getting to collaborate, Jared, with you and learn a bit more about, the vulnerability intelligence side of things and what you guys do there at Mandiant, which is great. And then Jared, give us, a view into your life and day in the life at Mandiant and what you're working on regularly. Sorry, I said Jared, Caleb.
I was like, well, if you want him to go again, like, I guess he didn't want the 10-second version. So,
Can we restart the webinar today?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. Yeah. So my name is Caleb. I've been in Mandiant for a couple of years now, and so my background, as Patrick stated, is in security operations. And so what that means is we help to operationalize security programs. So if it's coming from a true like SOC analyst to VM programs and operationalizing that, as well as applying threat intelligence, whenever possible. So overall, vulnerability management is one of my emphases, but I do focus heavily on other aspects of security operations. So that can be anywhere from helping to make SOCs more efficient to making sure their detections are functioning correctly, and then also how vulnerability management fits into a security operations center and how you can bring it all together. So
that's great. I know a lot of people reach out to me for advice on how to tackle as a whole vulnerability management program, and you've been integral in helping a lot of our customers and a lot of different organizations with that. So thank you, appreciate it. All right, we're gonna start, and we're gonna dive into some threat intel stuff, which I'm excited about. And one of the things more recently, Jared, that you posted and have been talking about, and people get excited about generally, is roughly 0 days, which we'll talk more about, but specifically time to exploit trends between the last couple of years. So do you want to give us a quick overview on your perspective?
Yeah, happy to. And just as a little bit of background, this is something that our team looks at yearly. Of course, last year we did a 2-year span, but we just find it interesting. We have a lot of great data that we've been collecting over the years, and to be able to do these trending pieces that step back and take a look, it can tell us a lot about how people can defend against the things that we're seeing. But in this past year, we did this timed exploit trends, looking at some key takeaways from what we saw overall in exploitation over 2 full years. The big ones here that are obviously worth pointing out, of all the vulnerabilities that we saw newly exploited over that 2-year span, 62% of those vulnerabilities were exploited at 0 days. I think a lot of people are always surprised at how many of the vulnerabilities we see exploited are first exploited as a 0 day, but it's definitely the majority. And along with that, we are seeing more and more vulnerabilities getting exploited year over year. The total number of vulnerabilities is increasing for sure. But there's also interesting things, as we see more exploited, the ratios and things like the 0 day and versus end day stay virtually the same within fractions of a percentage point. So it's pretty interesting to see that continue. But other things that we thought that are worth pointing out, in terms of timing of when you're most likely to see exploitation. Exploitation is most likely to occur, as we said, either before a patch is available or by the end of the first month following the release of a patch. So beyond that first month, the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited drastically decreases. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it definitely decreases significantly. And then one of the last little interesting things to note here, because always people are looking for good takeaways, and I know this doesn't sound like some miraculous finding, but Microsoft, Google, and Apple continue to be the most exploited vendors year over year. They are widely targeted because they're widely used. So I always tell people to make sure you have a plan to address these big boys, because they're the ones that are going to represent a lot. It's not from a lack of security or anything like that, but it's just the reality of these are most widely used, so they're the ones that are getting most widely targeted.
Hey, I on that note, surprisingly, I haven't released my research, so I'm giving a tidbit into it. But with SysAcav, I analyzed all the vulnerabilities added this year, and Apple actually overtook Microsoft, Mac OS over Windows. So just kind of interesting. Like there is some movement, I think, with the vendors themselves, the top 3. But yeah, I found that interesting. Throw in a quick little tidbit there.
And I'm just on that note real quick, another interesting tidbit I'll throw in is this last trending piece that we did was the first time that the big three represented less than half of the overall products, or the half of the overall vulnerabilities targeted in a span of time. So it definitely is showing also the variety of targeting that we're seeing overall as well.
Yep. Hey, and I think one other visual we wanted to highlight, same text on the left, right? But this kind of visualizes what you're talking about regarding time to exploitation, right?
Yep, as you see, this represents all the vulnerabilities that we saw first exploited after a patch was released. So you can see that as time goes on, those numbers decrease. So you're definitely most likely to get exploited within that first month time period following that patch.
Hey, I'm going to throw you a curveball, like real quick question on this one. So I know we're talking about new vulnerabilities, but like how frequently is someone like Mandiant seeing people getting popped with all the old vulnerabilities that are still within their environment?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There is always a glow or sexiness about the new 0-day stuff like that, but the reality is, in terms of pure volume, we see more attempted exploitation of older vulnerabilities than we do these newer ones. But that's also not surprising when you really think about it. Actors who have a new 0-day or newer vulnerabilities, even if they're not a 0-day, they're usually a little bit more cautious on how they use it. They're trying to use it strategically so as they're not trying to blow it. So you'll see less overall usage. Whereas older vulns, you'll see things like 2017 11882 everywhere, just because those exploit builders are freely available in the underground marketplace. They have a lower likelihood of success rate, but there's little risk in, an actor trying that out if they don't have a lot of those capabilities themselves. So you'll see wider usage of the older stuff, some of which is successful. So you really do have to consider both the old and the new.
Hey, and then question, and if you can answer it, cool or not. I'm just trying to get all my questions answered now. But you look at, I think earlier this year, TechCrunch published something about Russia paying $20 million for Apple 0-day, right? So when you're talking about new exploit development, like I assume that's why they're not spraying it, is because then the vendors are going to find out and patch it. Is that probably tied to that? I guess I'm theorizing.
I mean, it's definitely part of the equation. Depending whether it's financial dollars that you're spending or whether it's just time and effort that you have people spending to discover these things, you want to make sure that you are getting the most bang for your buck. So, typically there's a period of time where they're very strategic in its use and they're going to use it when they need it. And they're not going to use it widely. So if they have a scenario where they can use something else that's already off the shelf rather than their new 0-day, they're going to use that other thing. But yeah, it's for that exact reason. Is these are a lot of investment, whether it's financial, whether it's time or effort. So you want to make sure you're going to maximize the lifespan of that vulnerability as long as you can before everything gets exposed, and then it's just kind of that last minute fire sale that you just try to spray and pray and get as anything you can from it.
Yep. And then someone did ask, does this stat mean that 62% of vulnerabilities were discovered and exploited by malicious actors? If not, how is the term 0-day being used here?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the 0-day does get actually different definitions depending on who you're talking to sometimes. We use it as an exploitation by a malicious actor prior to a vulnerability being patched. So in that scenario, yes, all 62.2% of those were then discovered and exploited by an actor prior to a vendor being able to put out a patch.
So really high fidelity definition compared to some of the other quote unquote 0-day definitions.
Yeah.
I think I've like, you're actually talking about threat actor activity. All right, so we're gonna hop in. We went in the weeds in 0 days, right? And just kind of pulling up a little bit, right? So Jared, I want to talk a little bit about what vulnerability intelligence is. And one of the things I think on my take, it might be not as new to you, but I think for a lot of people, like they've mostly been using things like CVSS for vulnerability prioritization, and vulnerability intelligence hasn't really been a much of an accessible thing to most organizations until more recently, maybe the last 2, 3, 4 years. So, just curious, from your perspective, like, can you give us a brief overview on what vulnerability intelligence is?
Yeah, so my background is in threat intelligence. I did intelligence before I ever got into the cybersecurity field. So I have a very definitive idea of what intelligence is compared to like what some other people may think. So it's all about the role of an analyst who inserts themselves into a process, and they are evaluating various data sources. They are trying to make sense, and they're trying to distill a lot of different pieces of information to have a common picture that can be related to other things and then shared to a decision maker for a clear decision point advantage. It's always intelligence isn't the person who makes the decision. We are providing you with all the information you need to make a well-informed decision on behalf of your organization. So how does that relate to what we do in vulnerabilities? First and foremost, we talk about the data set. So as a company, we are trying to collect as much data about vulnerabilities as we can. That includes everything that you can find out in the open source, but then there's also a lot of internal data sources that we are lucky to have, being a company that we are, through things like our underground research capabilities, through our breach investigations, through our incident response engagements. That stuff is valuable. But we're taking and distilling all that information from these various places to not just say, what are the vulnerabilities that exist, but more importantly, which of those are being exploited in the wild, for what type of activity and what kind of impact that can have on a customer environment, and ultimately, like, what actions can a target organization take to protect themselves. So it's really, to say it another time, it's trying to be intelligence, not another feed of data, like a hose or a fire hose of data. It's really kind of focusing on that threat and exploitation context to really kind of create a framework to help people make better decisions.
Hey, and on that note, like, you put together also some of these things as far as what questions it helps people answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to walk us through these as well?
But yeah, it's just like I just said, and I guess I kind of jumped the gun on this one. But yeah, like
That's
I said,
right.
There's a lot of places that focus on purely kind of what are the vulnerabilities that are out there. But I think what we have come to realize is, when I first started engaging organizations in my role, I'll be honest, there used to be a discussion of like, hey, what things do we get to first, with this kind of unspoken acknowledgement that, hey, we're going to get to every vulnerability. And the reality is, like, that's just not the world we live in. And I think it's hard for sometimes people to say that out loud, but I think it's very realistic to say we're not going to be able to patch everything. So it's identifying not just what are the vulnerabilities that exist, because there's hundreds of thousands now, but it's identifying which are the ones that are going to have the most impact or threat to your organization. And we recommend doing that by which are being exploited, and identifying the potential impact of that exploitation if it does happen. And as we said at the end, ultimately, it's not really intelligence if there's not a proposed action that can take place. So we're also trying to answer the question, what can a target do to protect themselves from this type of activity?
Great. I mean, certainly I see it from a help perspective. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people overlook is, you can go and grab some OSINT information off of like a lot of my research in data viz, it's like grabbing SysACAV or grabbing gray noise or grabbing other indicators. Like, they're nice, but they don't actually tell you much of anything beyond the information provided. I guess gray noise is commercial, so I shouldn't put it in that bucket. But yeah, the real work and what I see continually, and we'll get into the vulnerability intelligence depth, is like there's real information analysis and work that goes in to make a decision about the actual threats, or maybe not decision, but information, so you can make the informed decisions on what action to take. And it's a huge huge value add for organizations that have access to that.
Yeah, and we don't
say.
take things at face value from the sources that they come. We have these human analysts who have been doing these for years, and they're applying their expertise to kind of make sense, heads or tails, of what the information that's coming, to really kind of to set a true level set. Here's the reality of what we're seeing, and here's how it can be used against you. It's really helpful to do it that way.
Great. Yeah, and then do you want to walk us through the? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to add one thing just to key off of that. So if you see a lot of folks will say vulnerability management, I'm actually very specific in saying threat and vulnerability management. And that's just one of the things that, as to Jared's point, really taking, more than just, hey, a vulnerability, but a threat, right? That's what the threat intelligence helps you do, is transform that from, hey, this is a vulnerability in my environment, to, hey, this is a threat to my environment. So you'll see me, like, if you go on like my LinkedIn, like I say, threat and vulnerability management, TVM. I key off that all the time. I very, very rarely say just VM, because it's way more effective when you're able to add that threat intelligence to add that threat piece. So just one extra piece there. So
yeah, we might have to rebrand with TVM.
I'm all about it.
Yeah, hey, Gardner, we're creating a new category, TVM. Love you, analysts, if there's any of you on. We need some more acronyms in this world. So hey, so I think I have a few slides. If these aren't helpful or we don't want to talk to them, it's fine, right? One is the threat-based patch prioritization. I don't know if there's anything you guys want to point out here or talk about in relation to Mandiant's philosophy.
Yeah, I think this is actually helpful to piggyback off of just what Caleb was saying. This is a little graphic that I put together years ago, and I'm happy to see that this thing pops up in more and more places. But this is kind of an admittedly sometimes oversimplified approach to kind of how I help people who are struggling to kind of approach prioritization, better orient themselves. And as you'll see on the pyramid, it's broken into three main categories. The top part of the pyramid is what we call active threats. The middle part is potential threats, and the bottom is no threats. So simply what this is pointing to is the order that you should kind of focus on in most scenarios. Not every scenario, but in most scenarios. And that is, at the top, if you know something that is directly targeting your organization, the you in the scenario, that's typically where you're going to want to start. Take care of the active threats against your organization first. After that, if you know that there are things that are targeting organizations like yours, so whether that is in the same geographic region as yours, operating in the same industry as yours, but maybe not necessarily you directly, that could give you an idea of like a targeting pattern that you might just be next. So that's another good place to go. Once you take care of the you and the like you, we typically recommend going to general exploitation. So it's not targeting anyone like you, but it's out there. So it just may be a matter of time before opportunistic targeting comes your way. And then once you're done with those kind of three buckets of active threats, that's when we move on to the potential threat category. And the two things that we make up there are the code availability and the actor interest. I like to call this out specifically because I know there are entire vulnerability intelligence or vulnerability feeds that kind of lean heavily on these areas, because these are admittedly the two areas that are easier to see. But the reason we always say that these are kind of the second tier things to focus on is just because code is available or an actor is interested in doing something doesn't mean they are or will be able to. It's really getting the confluence of those two things together, the code and the interest, that turns something from a potential threat to an active threat. So if you've got the active threats taken care of, it's a good kind of second tier to go to kind of make sure you're taking care of the things that could come next, but it's not something that organizations should focus on solely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, in my research, same thing. There's also a lot I think we see this, a lot more vulnerabilities have POCs nowadays. And the availability and whether they work or not is a whole nother question, I think. But I think actively, like somewhere, between your data set or others, it's like there's at least 15% of all CVEs have a POC. Whether it works or not is a whole nother question. I think from my perspective too.
And there was a time where we used to try to test every single POC out there, but that's also like the number of vulns that's skyrocketed over the years and is not a feasible task for us to do anymore.
Yeah. That's great. So Caleb, I think as we're getting into the how-to, right? I want to transition a little bit into some of the fields with Mandiant vulnerability intelligence and how people might consider using them in their decisioning with prioritization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Jared, please jump in anytime you want to add some context here, as your team is the one that actually develops these fields. So the way to think about the difference, just for one bit of tidbit of how Jared and my roles differ. Jared's team develops the intelligence, and then I help operationalize it, which means I help put it into a company's profile or program, right? So to that point, just starting off at the very top, we like to say risk-based vulnerability management. And Jared's team's done a great job at assigning a risk rating, right? So this is kind of regardless. I'm sure CVSS is a factor in the risk, but it kind of takes an overall encompassing, hey, what is the actual risk to my organization, and assign that a criticality, right? Which in critical, high, medium, low. So depending on I don't even want to say maturity, but maturity of it. And then how mature your CTI program is, or what resources you have available to dive into threat intelligence. The risk rating right there is a great field just to key off of, aside from CVSS, right? So in perspective, Jared, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say two things. People are really excited about CVSS in our chat, right? So anything we can say tying it back to there, which I'll comment in a second. Whether people are gonna like it or not is another thing. And then I love what CVSS is doing, but there's some things with the scoring system I think that are highly differentiated here. And so I think that's important. And then there was another comment about difference between threat intelligence and vulnerability intelligence. And I think my main thing there is, if you think about it, it's like we're talking about vulnerability centric intelligence and what you're going to patch or not patch, whereas threat intelligence historically has been a large slew of other things. So think of it as like very, very narrow and specific. I don't know if I said that right.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more maybe flavor to that. So we have, we develop things called threat profiles for organizations, and really that's kind of a general encompassing. Hey, here's the threat intelligence, and here's the actors, or the type of actors, whether it's an UNC group or a FIN group or an APT, that are most likely to target your organization, right? So for the vulnerability intelligence, we would take that one step further. Okay, these specific vulnerabilities or these types of vulnerabilities are known to be exploited by those threat actors, right? So in the Mandiant Advantage portal and in the data that we have, we tie specific CVEs to threat actors and their activity. So if you say APT1, right, there is a list of CVEs that they commonly use, right? So that's probably a good way to differentiate it, is like, hey, threat profile or threat intelligence that you're over encompassing. Hey, here's your whole all the information that we know about who may target you, and then the vulnerability threat intelligence is what vulnerabilities they're going to use. So hopefully that made sense. But coming to
that's helpful. And then the other thing on the CVSS side is like their Mandiant risk rating is completely upside down to CVS philosophy, I'd say. And that like CVSS assumes high scores based on an impact of a vulnerability, whereas like the risk rating is focused on threat from a priority perspective first. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, if you want to bring up that slide real quick, Patrick, I'll talk to that real quick. Yeah, fundamentally, the way we've approached our ratings for Mandiant is this kind of focus of listening to customers over the years and hearing, they have tons of vulnerabilities in their environment, and they're really just looking for, I just need to know where to start first. So this is, for people looking at the slides, this is a comparison of 4 years of how we rated vulnerabilities versus how the CVSS rated those same vulnerabilities in the same low, medium, high critical scale. And 57% of all vulnerabilities in CVSS were high or greater, whereas only 3.4% of the way my analysts rated them were either high or greater than those same ideas. And the whole idea is, especially with my philosophy with critical, is if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. So when Mandiant tells you something is critical, what we're telling you is this is a drop everything you're doing vulnerability and focus on this. Just quite frankly, when you look at the CVSS scores, we have nearly 1,000 or more vulnerabilities a year that are critical. I don't know how organizations are supposed to make good, clear decisions about like the true impact. And once again, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad if they use CVSS. I know a lot of organizations do. But what CVSS measures is severity, and it wasn't the same as risk. It's more looking at under the worst possible scenario, how bad could it be? But oftentimes when you apply a little bit of logic to the vulnerability and how an adversary would actually leverage it in a real world scenario, I think that's ultimately where a lot of things fall down and become low risk, because it just wouldn't make sense. Those vulnerabilities where, you need to have admin access to a box to potentially leak sensitive information. Well, if I already had admin access to that box, there's a lot of other things I would be doing and not exploiting that vulnerability. So that's technically possible, but most cases out the window.
Yeah, I think,
that's helpful.
Go ahead, Patrick. Sorry.
I was going back to you, Caleb. I know we dogged around a little bit, but yeah, it's all you.
Yeah, no, I think that Jared hit it. Just to add a little bit more to it is the CVSS is really the severity, but really when you take a risk-based approach and you look at it big picture and you say, okay, somebody has to compromise, my device, right? Okay, so they've already bypassed probably email security controls and possibly EDR, AV, right? Like once you start stacking those up, that's where the risk base comes in, where it's like, yes, this could in a perfect world where this was exploited, that could be very bad, but the chances of that happening are very low. And it's all a risk game, right? It's a risk management game at that point. And what threat intel does is helps you apply that to vulnerability, threat and vulnerability management, where you can truly apply, say, hey, this is what an actual risk base, like the chances of that being exploited are so slim because these 10 other things have to occur before they even get to that point. That's not necessarily something you want your remediation teams to focus on, right? So the exploit, yeah, and then so again, and the way that I typically look at these, right? So when you look at the risk rating, right, the risk rating is just in and of itself a very good way to say, hey, I'm going to start, and this is the top down, right? For reference, Jared can keep me honest on numbers, but I was in our portal the other day and I just filtered on what and how many total vulnerabilities have been assessed. And I think it's somewhere around 395,000 vulnerabilities have been assessed, and of those 395,000, there's only 10 that we've rated as critical, right? And that's taking that risk-based approach. So Jared, I don't know if you want to refute those numbers, but that's at least what I saw in the portal the other day. So
yeah, the total number is a little bit lower, but not significantly. And then yeah, it's 10, but that goes back to what I said earlier. We really want to make sure that when somebody hears the word that Mandiant called something critical, that perks their ears up and they know to take it serious.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I have a slide further down that I'll go into a little bit more about, hey, if it is truly critical and it's internet exposed, like if you can't patch within 24 hours, that's typically what we mean is, hey, you need to patch this like yesterday, a type of deal when it gets that critical rating. But just to kind of go down some more of the fields, I kind of guess get back on target. So the exploitation rating, you use these to stack, right? So if it's a critical, you could then have something, well, it's high and maybe it's not necessarily confirmed or even available, the exploit, right? Maybe it is just in a POC state, or maybe there's anticipated, right? So you can essentially stack these vulnerabilities where, okay, I've made it through the 10 criticals there are. I don't have any of those in my environment. Okay, now there's high, and there's a lot more highs than there would be criticals. So you can use that additional field, the exploitation rating, and it kind of builds you a heat map. Okay, well, now what's a high and wide, right? There's wide exploitation, which means this is high risk, and there's wide exploitation out in the wild. Similar with ease of attack and exploit consequences, right? So typically you would use that to say, all right, information disclosure may be less severe in my environment, and code execution, we want to prioritize more. So just having those very plain and those very data-centric attributes helps you to prioritize and really stack and get those as specific as you want to your organization. Exploit vectors, that comes into play once you talk about general internet facing, internal versus external exposure. right? So if it's internal exposure and it's general network connectivity, you can think about that where, hey, they have to already be in my network, which you may or may not be confident that there's threat actors or malicious actors in your environment. But that's kind of how you can start to stack those and really use those fields. And we'll get into a little bit of a demo here in a few minutes where we can show how you can write those rules and just a couple of examples of that, right?
All right, sweet. Hey, yeah, so I think talking about that a little bit more, we did hop on 0 day, right? So if you want to give us an overview, I think on preparedness, and then we can hop into some of the how-to stuff, just being mindful of time. I think that would be awesome to continue the conversation. So yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I think I have my view on this, but and I think it's very similar. But I'd love to hear your perspective on 0 days and how people can be prepared to respond to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I got a couple, and this is really where our bread and butter in like the security operations world comes in, right? And I see kind of the 3 high levels here, right? Up-to-date asset inventory, an incident response plan, and adequate threat intelligence, right? Those are the 3 main areas that I see as for being prepared for a 0 day, right? And up-to-date asset inventory, I mean, this truly means where, hey, if you start to see exploitation, right? Let's take a move it, for example. Those are sort of the vendors and the products that you need to know is in your environment, so that as soon as that comes, you can start to put a plan together, right? A lot of time, and I see this in many organizations, a lot of time is taken just, hey, do we have this in our environment at all, right? I mean, this should be something within your asset inventory, and that's where the benefit is, hey, this is posted, hey, there's active exploitation. Do we have this? Is this anything we need to worry about, or is this just noise and we don't need to do that? We don't need to have any sort of reaction to it, right? So the asset inventory is absolutely critical for that, and it's also why it's one of the top controls, and has been one of the top controls, by SANS for the last 10 years. It's not an exact quote, but it's been asset inventory, or software and hardware inventory has been the top 2 controls for a long time. And I like this. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say at Nucleus, right? Like, we have to assume that nobody has an asset inventory, and that's like the first step we do is build it based on whatever data you give us. Mm-hmm. Because it is such a critical component of VM. And so we have some customers like that use our asset inventory as an asset inventory. It's not purpose built necessarily for some of the other use cases of asset inventories, but like for a vuln management perspective, like you're 100% right. Like, if you don't know what you have or you don't have visibility into it, good luck.
How do you protect what you don't know you don't have, right?
Yep.
And that's why we're really this Venn diagram. I think that there's typically, what I've seen on any asset inventory, right? You have your known knowns, right? Hey, I'm able to scan this asset, so I know it's there and I have data on it. You have your known unknowns, where you're like, hey, there's a whole portion of our network where somebody at some point, like, I haven't been given the green light to go ahead and scan that internally, so I know there's something over there, I just don't know exactly what it is. And then you have your other category of unknown unknowns, right? Where you just like, hey, there's a chance, and then I don't really know where it would be, but it's possible, right? And so that's what you try to hopefully eliminate that far right section there with your asset inventory, is make that as little as possible. But typically those are 3 categories that I've seen. Most organizations would probably classify all their assets into one of those 3, and usually a combination of the 3. So the last piece I wanted to on this is a regular patching cadence to ensure patches are effectively taking place, right? Not just push a button. This really comes down to, and I don't typically like to use the word compliance, but typically a patch compliance, right? So, hey, the remediation team says, hey, this went out, and yeah, we patched this, we pushed this button, 2 weeks ago. Well, hey, I'm still showing this with my scanner, I'm still showing this 2 weeks later, and these assets as of yesterday we're still showing vulnerable, right? And a lot of times what I found is that occurs because there's no regular like reboot or restart of certain applications, where, hey, a weekly sort of reboot of workstations, and that's always going to be a bit of a conversation with the user base, but especially for user laptops, right? You should really consider having something like a weekly cadence, hey, every Friday at 5 p.m. or whatever time of the week works best, to at least do a hard reboot of those devices once a week. is typically very effective at making sure that those patches actually take effect and they're not just sitting in a queue waiting to apply.
It's interesting you say that, because I was just actually talking to someone about this, and I'm like, man, we should make a monthly like patch Wednesday, right? Or I'm sorry, reboot Wednesday, where everyone reboots, or maybe it's Thursday or Friday, but it's like that little thing can make a huge difference. And I know it's not only laptops, it's also like servers and applications, which people pride themselves on how long those things live. But the reality is, a lot of times patches are applied, but the services or server are never actually restarted.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, just one more piece on that. So if you look at, you know, the top 3 vendors, right? Microsoft, Apple, and Google, right? A lot of those are browser based. So how often is it that you have the little button at the top of your Chrome window that says relaunch to update, right? That sort of thing is what that really will help is Chrome, especially when it's talking about a user interaction and those vulnerabilities with the browser where the browsers could be owned. That's just critical. I mean, not necessarily, you know, I restart my Chrome every single day, but you know, a lot of it's also because I have, you know, 2,000 tabs open that I need to clean up and restart fresh for the day. But not everyone's like that.
I'm guilty.
Yeah,
I'm very guilty. Like, I have to remind myself that I have to, you know, leave my MacBook open and do an install or restart on a regular basis. So
absolutely. So yeah, just to move, and I'll be quick through these next ones. So incident response plan. You know, not a lot I have not seen a lot of emphasis of vulnerability management into an incident response plan. But honestly, especially with like the numbers that we've shown and 62%, 62.2% are vulnerabilities are exploited as 0 days. If it's a 0 day and you have it in your environment, you almost have to have the conversation of, hey, do we need some sort of incident response here? Do we need to go in and do we need to look for signs of exploitation? Right, a lot of the Citrix vulnerabilities that were exploited, you know, we actually developed a Citrix scanner, we being Mandiant, not myself, but developed a Citrix scanner for you to go and look for the IOCs. Anytime there is a 0 day and you have that product, that has to be a conversation that you know, the VM team and the SOC need to have, and really having it, the point of that bullet is to have it documented, say, hey, if there is a 0 day that's announced and we have, you know, X software, X hardware in our environment, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Because that time is invaluable from either, you know, patching it to get the threat actor, prevent them from coming in, or kicking them out, right? As much as you can possibly limit the time, and anytime you can document something to say, hey, I picked this up in day 2, you know, at this job, I need to go and do this. You know, you have to be able to go through and just run the cycles. It has to be mindless things, so that the craziness of, oh my gosh, another 0 day, or hey, you know, we might have been exploited with this. You know, anytime you can document and have something to go back and read, you know, when you're in kind of a sane state of mind, is going to help your response significantly. And I know that there is a quote, and if anyone knows who said this first, this wasn't me, but it's ensure internet-facing systems can be patched or taken offline within 24 hours. You know, if you can't do that, then you really have no business of having it out there. I know that's been widely used, but I absolutely completely agree. When you have something, you know, a Move It or an Apache Struts application, right? We just had a recent unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability, you know, disclosed recently. If you can't patch that, then you're really putting a risk to your organization, and that has to be a conversation you have with the asset owners and upper management. They truly understand the risk of that not being able to do that. You know, could have significant impact for your organization. So, but Patrick, anything to add to that, or?
No, I mean, I observe the same things. I mean, it's, you know, get your asset inventory, patch management, restart. I think like we need a new mantra of restart your applications and devices regularly. Maybe that needs to be like a directive from the White House. The IR response plan, you know, it's like, how many people have these technologies that have 0 days out there and they don't do any IR? Probably the majority of organizations right now. So I thought it was cool what you guys did with the Citrix detection tool. In reality, like most network devices don't have any detection built into them at all. So that, you know, that poses its own things. And then the threat intelligence side too, I tell people, like, we're biased. We give every customer Mandiant threat intelligence. We're a big promotion of commercial threat intelligence, but like, if you can't, at least start with things like SysCab and EPSS. Like, it's better than the alternative of using CVSS to get started. Is my take there as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's supposed to be an and open source and paid or commercial threat intelligence. I guess that was a typo that I don't have the word and.
I was wondering, I'm like, open source paid threat
No,
intelligence.
there's
like,
I just caught that. There's supposed to be an and in there. So yeah, it's a mix, right? So you have to use what's really available. If you can't get commercial threat intelligence or paid threat intelligence, then do what you can and see what's out there in the internet, right? Is Bleeping Computer or the Hacker News, like what's the chatter about, right? That's the best you can do. Then you got to do that at least, right?
Yep. Yeah, and well, I just think there's better things than just the news nowadays, like SysCab, EPSS.
Yep.
There's Gray Noise, Shadow Server, semi-open, I'd say, but yeah, none of them, none of them are going to be as pervasive as you start getting into like depth and really helping you decision on all the different stuff that comes in with rich sources like Mandiant commercial intelligence. So cool. Hey, I want to be mindful of time. So we have about 12 minutes. So do we want to hop to, you were going to show some stuff from a demo perspective, or does that sound
absolutely.
Good?
Yep, it does.
People, hey, and I want to answer everyone's questions, but we're just gonna be mindful of time here too. So don't hesitate to hit us up on LinkedIn.
So just
hold this, if you want.
Hold this slide for just 1 second. So this slide, and we'll get into demo to how a number like this is gotten, right? And so really this just shows kind of the impact. If you look at 707 critical vulnerabilities down to 6 confirmed critical threats. Right, this is where that threat and vulnerability management comes in, and this can be kind of the lasting impact. This number holds relatively true for most organizations that we've helped to do this. So this is obviously some sanitized numbers, and not necessarily can't share exactly where it was, but that significant reduction, if you're trying to say, hey, I want you to focus on these 6 criticals before you get to anything else, that's kind of the power. And this slide shows you the power of what could be in your environment. So yeah, aside from that, I'll jump over to, you have to stop
I'll give it
sharing.
over to you. I'm done. Yeah, I think just so everyone knows, it's like, you can recast, and I think that's some of the stuff we're going to show from a rules perspective within Nucleus. So combination, in working with Caleb and some different joint customers, this is how they're using Nucleus and in Mandiant's intelligence, which is great. Go ahead.
All right, you can see my screen, right? You can see Nucleus up here.
Yep. A lot of Oracle vulnerabilities. Java.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's some good vulnerabilities in this data. So just so everyone's aware, in case it's not apparently clear, so Nucleus and Mandiant have a strategic partnership. Where our threat intelligence is out of the box in the Nucleus product. So what you're seeing is if you're a Nucleus customer, you automatically will get a lot of these. You'll get all this intel in the data. This is a really, really great way to be able to come in and to write these rules, right? So we're going to start with a brand new rule. And this is typically how we would start the engagement. So prior to putting in these rules, we typically try to build a threat profile, which takes a look at an organization, as we kind of mentioned, said, hey, these are the threat actors, or these are the types of threat actors that are most likely to target your organization. And what we do is we take that data and we put that in, and we hard code that into these automation rules, which will help us reprioritize. So we're going to call this rule a test rule. And if we go to a condition, we want to say, hey, let's look at the Mandiant risk rating. And I want to say any of the Mandiant risk rating if it's critical or if it's high. And then I want to put this criteria for any of my assets that are exposed to the internet. Right. And then I want to add one more vulnerability criteria. And that is to say the exploitation rating is one of wide or confirmed. And so what this is doing is so we're going to take any vulnerability and any data attribute that is within your environment, right? So this typically will ingest your scan data from your Rapid7, your Tenable, your Qualys, Barcode, name your other tool, ingest it in here, and you want to apply this rule to prioritize it. So next you want to go and you want to say, hey, I'm going to set the exploitability to exploitable, which may or may not already be done. But I also want to change the severity, regardless of CVSS. I want to go ahead and make that a critical, because even if the risk is higher critical, if it's an internet exposed or a public accessible system, that likely is something critical that you need to look at patching, immediately. And really, any sort of additional attributes you want to set, right? We can come in here and I also want to say, if the EPSS score, right, to use multiple different feeds, is greater than 0.9, which EPSS is, if this is translated to a percentage. So this would say EPSS says there's 90% likelihood that this would be exploited in the wild in the next 30 days, right? So you can stack all these different attributes, and this is exactly how. And then we also want to say, hey, we also want to look at these threat actors. And typically when we do a threat profile, we'll have literally a threat, a list of actors. So we'll say APT1, for example. So we're going to come in and we're going to say, hey, we want to make sure this is set to exploitable. We want to change the criticality to critical. And we want to say that this is due in 3 days from right now. So save and finish, and then that's going to automatically apply to any of your vulnerabilities. But that's really how we would prioritize and take and really truly operationalize that. Hey, the data is ingested, and then we're going to go and use that to reprioritize all of our vulnerabilities. Patrick, anything to add, or if not, I was going to go and just pull up an example in here.
Yeah, you can pull up an example.
Okay. So all those attributes, the way that this is truly in here, you come in here and you have your vulnerability information, which would come from your scanner. You look at your instances, which is, this is one instance. And then here's all your intelligence. Hey, for this vulnerability, there's these CVEs. And then this right here is actually a look into the data that's in Mandiant Advantage and the data that Jared's team pulls together. So that's ported over here, and you're able to essentially prioritize, and any of these fields can be something that you key off of. One thing that I think we talked about heavily was, looking at the risk-based analysis, say, hey, CVSS says that, some of these are, 9.8, 9.8, and there's a medium. Well, you're able to kind of come in here and look at this analysis. And Jared, I don't know if you want to talk to this analysis anymore, but this essentially is the manual analysis that Jared's team does to talk about the risk.
Yeah, I'll just mention something real quickly. I mean, that's the type of additional context that we're going to provide on some of the bigger ones. We can't do it on all several 100,000 vulnerabilities, but yeah, we try to give an idea to people who have the intelligence, how it would be exploited, in what way. But ultimately, if we're seeing activity, we're trying to characterize the type of activity that we're seeing so people are aware who's doing it, against whom, and ultimately, once again, what are the things that are going to be characteristics of that activity that they can use to protect themselves, as well as just a bunch of other metadata that we have. But that's kind of the analyst written version of it there.
Yeah, and
that's great.
Actually, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is the type of stuff that saves people a ton of time of doing their own analysis and trying to Google search and research every vuln. Is my take, not only the analysis, but also the mitigations, like, oh, is there a patch available? I mean, or what other mitigation could I take action on, right? That's going to be useful. So just the reality of having this information quickly accessible. And then I think the other thing is it's defendable, right? It's much more defendable than but it only had a CVSS score of 4. Which doesn't incorporate threat and really isn't a defendable reason on why you didn't patch something. I think it used to be, but I think quickly that's becoming less and less as threat intelligence becomes much more accessible.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and you kind of hit it on the nail on the head there. So I don't know any VM team that would typically say they have an abundance of resources to be able to do this right up, right? And so, thinking through that, those additional attributes where you have an analyst that can give you we'll call it a more plain language analysis of a vulnerability is immensely helpful. Because you can take, say, a junior analyst who is right out of college and may not necessarily have a ton of experience. They can come in and read that and say, hey, this is risky because X, Y, and Z. and they have someone who it's just data that's at their fingertips that's much more plain than coming in saying, oh, according to its banner, the version of PHP running on the remote web server is this, and therefore, all this, it's just a lot. And to be able to go in there and quickly analyze that, I've just not seen a lot of teams that are staffed to do that at scale, especially when you're talking, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, and thousands of assets, right? It's very difficult. And that piece alone, to have that applied immediately next to, hey, this is on our environment, is absolutely incredibly powerful to have, right? One more rule that that this really to operationalize the 0 day, you should have an intake for when 0 days are. How are you analyzing those 0 days, right? Being able to document and start a triage, right? Being able to go through and say, like, all right, what attributes do I need? And then what attributes are available? And then do I have them in my environment, right? Like, that's incredibly powerful to be able to go in and do, and to be able to have that all in one platform. Even before, because sometimes you gotta beat the scanners, depending on the severity, and the risk is, do I need to beat the scanners to seeing if this is in my environment or not, right? So
yeah, one of the things that was brought up earlier, and this comes up a lot, is yes, some of the scanners have their own risk scores, some have threat intelligence, and I think that's great. Like, use it if you can. The challenge is information is now multi-sourced from a VM program perspective. So, normally, at least, as you start getting enterprises, it's like normally there's 10, 20, 30 different sources where vuln and asset information is coming from. Yep. And unfortunately, you can't apply a scanner risk score, I'm not going to name vendors, across all those assets. So it becomes something that isn't really good at scale. And so that's what I think is really, really useful is, using threat intelligence that is pervasive across CVEs and accessible across data sets is really, really important. So Mandiant, the risk rating is a good example of that. EPSS, CAV, like they apply to all things, which is great. So that might answer some of the question someone had there. We have like 1 minute left, so I just want to be mindful of people's time. Caleb, what were you gonna say?
I was just saying, to that point about the credibility, right? And make sure that your threat intelligence source, if you trust, and you found that analysis and that risk score to hold true, then you just have to take that into account. The credibility of your threat intelligence source is the only thing. Make sure that is something that you can adequately trust. I can trust scanner, A's threat intelligence because of this. Like, this is why our organization trusts them, and we're okay with using that, right? So yeah, I know time, so.
That's all right. This has been a great discussion. I think people are really interested. A few different things. First off, as we wrap up, people are definitely, there's some other questions. I think EPSS thresholds, reach out to me on LinkedIn. What's the best way of getting a hold of you two if people have questions after today's call about Mandiant threat intelligence? I'm happy to answer them on my LinkedIn too. But is there a good way people can get in touch if they're interested?
Yeah, I mean, mine is probably just going to be, honestly, to email me. My LinkedIn is very hit or miss whether I'm on or not. So I'll put my email in the chat here, and that's probably the best way to get a hold of me, to ask me any questions. Yeah, absolutely happy. Anytime anyone wants to talk through it, I'm happy to get some time on the calendar and go through anything. So
cool.
Yeah, and for me, sorry, real quick, I'm on LinkedIn as well. So if people need anything, that's an easy way to get a hold of me.
Yeah, and then twofold. What we showed today is in our in Nucleus in partnership with Mandiant, which is great. So those capabilities that we saw. There's also Mandiant Advantage on the Intel side, separate of Nucleus. And then next month I'll be spending time with Scott, our COO. We'll be talking about how to automate and streamline vulnerability management processes. So some of the stuff we hopped in, almost like a light primer, as far as like decisioning automation within your vulnerability management program. So we'll talk high level of what things you can automate, and then we'll dive into how you can actually automate them with Nucleus, which is pretty exciting and fun. And then I did want to highlight too, I don't product pitch often, but if you want to see how Nucleus works, are interested in a demo, don't hesitate to scan here. Get a demo on demand of the product as well. And then as always, you can reach out to me or go to nucleussec.com to engage with us. I think there's a contact us page in the demo form, and we'll get you hooked up with the right people to talk. So I appreciate Jared and Caleb, your times. I'm going to send threat actor clocks in the mail. So make sure you drop me your email address. So you have something fun for the holidays, and really appreciate you guys as far as collaborating with us here at Nucleus. Thanks so much for your partnership. It's greatly appreciated.
No, love the time. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Jared.
Yeah, any last advice, last words?
Use threat intelligence whenever and wherever, and that's about as good as I can get.
Be safe, be adaptable, and good luck.
There you go.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for joining, and greatly appreciate today, and have a happy holidays.
Yeah.